Thank you, Johannes, and thanks for inviting me to this interesting project. Hello to everyone again. I have been interested in European integration and in particular Lithuania's accession into the EU since I was a student in early 90s and many things that I will be talking about during this lecture are in my recent article, which just came out a few weeks ago by Oxford University Press, which is still online, but it's going to be part of European Union Politics Encyclopedia. So I am quoting much more in my article. Here you will see some of the quotes, which I think are quite representative of the European Union and Europe more generally narrative in Lithuania. And to start with, you can see the outline of my talk. Actually, you can also see the map of the Northern Europe. I thought it is quite appropriate for this talk about narratives because it shows you the group which has been recently attracting attention of some analysts and journalists, in particular the Financial Times or the Economist. It is called the New Hanseatic League, as you can see, and it includes Baltic states, Nordic EU members, the Netherlands and Ireland, and this grouping has been meeting in the capacity of ministers of finance and issuing public joint declarations on how these countries see current European Union priorities, in particular implementation of fiscal policy rules that are in the EU, completion of the single market, capitals union, banking union, and so on. But I thought the title of this group is quite interesting because it also has some symbolic meaning, though you might wonder why Germany is part of not this group, since it was linked to Hanseatic League, to the original Hanseatic League. But I will leave that for the Q&A session if there are any questions about this. But to get back to what I will be presenting during this talk, first of all, I will start with the key arguments, and then we'll elaborate on each of them, presenting the context and motivation of EU accession of Lithuania. But in most cases, what I will be saying could be applied to the same extent to other two Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, although there were some particularities of accession process for each of the three Baltic states, but the general context and motivation have been rather similar. Then I will turn to the politics of EU accession, including how general public in Lithuania and other Baltic states views European Union, and how the narrative on the European Union evolved during these almost exactly 15 years since the Baltic states, together with some other Central European countries, joined the European Union on the 1st of May in 2004. And we'll conclude with some broad observations comparing narratives on Europe in Lithuania and other Baltic states to other EU member states. So my main arguments, first of all, have to do with how the whole debate about return to Europe was framed in Lithuania since late 80s and in particular early 90s. Lithuania was the first from the former Soviet Union to re-establish independence after half a century of occupation. And this had, of course, an important impact on how the so-called return to Europe was seen in public debates. In Lithuania, it was seen as part of the re-establishment of the sovereignty of Lithuania. So integration into Western organizations was not something that was linked so much to pooling sovereignty, to delegating sovereignty, as it has been for quite a long time seen in the EU, but first of all, recognition by those institutions, by international organizations, was already an important sign of being returning to the international arena of sovereign states. So since early 90s, I would say our narrative on Europe was more or less narrative on, first of all, establishing official relations with European communities, later European Union, and afterwards becoming a member of the European Union. So Europe is usually associated with European Union, though of course people are aware that not all European countries are part of this organization. So this is one important element to have in mind. Another important feature of how EU is seen in Lithuania has to do with security context, geopolitics and security concerns, which first of all are linked to complicated history of this part of Europe, and in particular Soviet occupation. So a lot of what was being implemented during 1990s, most of the reforms, including integration into the European Union, were to a large extent motivated by security concerns. And this meant reducing dependence on Russia and post-Soviet space more generally as much as possible, and integrating into the European Union. So these were very much interlinked processes, and the narrative on return to Europe had this security element in the background, which was and continues to be important until now. It became even more important since what happened in the Eastern neighborhood, in particular in 2014. Annexation of Crimea, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This contributed to even stronger attention being given to security concerns, and seeing membership in the EU and particular policies such as energy policy, also introduction of euro in 2015, also having important security dimension. And my last argument is that another important narrative which has to do with modernization of Lithuania as an outcome of being part of European Union has been important also, to some as important as seen from security perspective. But in recent years, in particular since 2008-2009, when emigration from Lithuania to Great Britain, Ireland, some other European countries peaked as a result of economic decline, it has been weakened by the debates to what extent Lithuania's membership in the European Union contributes to demographic problems and decline of population in Lithuania. So this is another important element of how narrative of modernization evolved in Lithuania. So briefly about the context. As I said, the end of the Cold War was important for the Baltic states because it opened the window of opportunity to re-establish independence. First of all, to demand more autonomy within the Soviet Union, but very quickly these movements for more autonomy turned into the demands for complete independence. And Lithuania was the first among the three Baltic states to declare re-establishment of independence on March 11th, 1990. Immediately, Moscow reacted to that by imposing economic blockade, by stopping supplies of energy resources. I'm mentioning that because this reinforced security concerns and the tendency to securitize, for example, energy policy and to aim for energy security on the level of the European Union, which has been one of the key priorities of Lithuania's European policies since it became a member in 2004. Something which is quite different, for example, in Germany, where many people, especially in business, see energy policy and trade in natural gas as just business. In Lithuania and other Baltic states, because of this historical legacy of dependence on supplies from Russia, and Russia using, at least that's the perception here, those supplies of natural gas for foreign policy, geopolitical purposes, this brings an important security dimension. So, return to Europe was mostly about reducing dependence on former Soviet Union, and this optimism regarding the end of history, to use this famous phrase of Francis Fukuyama, which was prevailing at the time in most of Western countries, was not so widely held in Lithuania, because there were still Soviet troops which left only in late '93, and there was a recent memory of occupation. So this had a direct effect on debates regarding Lithuania's place in Europe and what Europe means for Lithuanians. And you can see a quote of Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister twice, both times during economic crisis, first in 1999-2000, Prime Minister Andrius Kubilius, then he became Prime Minister after parliamentary elections again in the end of 2008, again during another economic crisis, and you can see that he talks about only two options. I think clearly referring to the third option that Lithuania formally held in interwar period, meaning neutrality, not aligning with any other alliances between the First and the Second World Wars. So after the experience of occupation in Lithuania, there was a very strong consensus that becoming part of Western organizations, including NATO and European Union, was the most important way how to re-establish and strengthen countries' statehood. So, as I said, security motive was important, and for some analysts, because of this, during early 90s, mid-90s, joining NATO was even more important than joining the European Union, something which again is quite different in some other European countries. For example, Finland, a country that was presented quite recently within this series of lectures. Modernization, as I said, was another very important element of return to Europe. Modernization in terms of economic catching up, in terms of reforms of governance, administration, public administration reforms, and another element, influence. By joining EU and other Western organizations, it was expected to gain so to speak, a seat at the table and to be part of the decision-making process, not to be left aside as it happened after the Second World War. I think, again, the politics of memory plays an important role in this. And you can see the quote at the bottom of this slide from the resolution that was adopted at the day of Lithuania's accession into the European Union, May 1st, 2004, which set out European policy priorities for Lithuania as a member of the EU and NATO. And again, in this quote, you can see all the key words that defined how membership of the EU has been viewed by political elites and analysts for most of the period since accession into the EU, being active, trying to be influential in the region, in particular in terms of mediating between Eastern neighbors and the European Union, security, prosperity, being a modern state. These are the key words of the narrative in Lithuania. But before joining in 2004, several things are worth mentioning. Again, in terms of politics of European Union integration, crisis seems to have been seen and acted as a window of opportunity, a mobilizing factor. First, when Estonia, but not Latvia and Lithuania, were invited to start accession negotiations after European Commission presented its first progress reports in '97. This was an important political shock for Lithuanian elites that really mobilized the efforts to accelerate preparation for negotiations, adoption of European Union legal norms. In terms of economic restructuring, financial crisis in Russia was important in '98-'99, which pushed Lithuanian companies to restructure their external trade towards European Union countries, to a large extent leaving Russia, though Russia remained an important trade partner. And later, actually, already in 2008-2009, when Lithuania was a member of the EU and experienced the effects of so-called Great Recession, the exit from this crisis led to the adoption of euro, which again is similar to what happened in Estonia and Latvia a few years earlier, but very different to the debates on membership in the Eurozone, either in Poland or in Greece at the time of the Eurozone crisis. So mobilization exposed a rather strong political consensus on EU membership, relatively strong. All parliamentary parties agree on the EU membership. And it's not surprising, having in mind that popular support for EU membership has also, since early 2000s, has been rather high, higher than EU's average. You can see numbers of how many voters turned to vote during the referendum, which was held in 2003 on accession into the EU, and how many of those supported joining the EU. And since then, despite fluctuations, support for the EU decreased during the time of crisis of 2008-2009. It increased again in recent years. This is data from last autumn's Eurobarometer on the question of trust in the EU, and you can see that Lithuanians are those that trust most of all EU member states in the European Union. Estonians, Latvians trust less, but still above EU average. If the question is about whether the EU membership is a positive thing, again, the relevant indicator for the Baltic states is above EU average. In the case of Lithuania, 48%. And when people are asked what are the main elements that they see as beneficial from the EU membership, interestingly, all three Baltic states, as you can see, followed by Germany and Finland, particularly value free movement of people. Again, I would say something that is probably linked to the memories of occupation and being very closed from the outside world, Western world, because differently from Germany, Baltic states are not in the center of the European Union. So I think this motive is important. Now, on the evolution of the EU narrative in Lithuania since 2004, first about the stable elements of the narrative, and as I said, security motive, security concerns are prevailing, and they are quite stable, even gaining importance in the last 5 years. They also are partly, they account for the focus on the Eastern Partnership, trying to bring Eastern neighbors, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or initially Belarus, to a different degree of success, closer to the European Union, is to some extent motivated by trying to extend the area of security further east. Not only security concerns account for this focus on Eastern Partnership, politics of memory, historical references also have their place in this, as I will show in a moment. And these concerns were quite clearly present during Lithuania's EU Council presidency in the second half of 2013, with the Eastern Partnership Summit in November 2013 becoming the most important event of the presidency. As I said, the actual events in Eastern neighborhood, Russia-Georgia conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict, reinforced the importance of security, and you can see one of the most recent annual address, quote from one of the most recent annual addresses of Lithuanian President Dalia Grybauskaitė, where she emphasizes geopolitics. And this has been reflected in prioritizing, after the accession, further integration of Lithuania into the rest of the European Union with a focus on infrastructure links. You could very often hear in Lithuania the phrase of Baltic states being an energy island, meaning separated from the rest of the European Union, despite the fact that they are members of the European Union. So you can see in this slide electricity connections, which are already, some are implemented, others are in the process of implementation. The main idea being to connect Baltic states with Nordic and Central European electricity markets. The same is happening with the natural gas connections. LNG terminals are being built. And Rail Baltica is another important project. Here you can see a picture from The Economist, which also discussed around 2013 the slow progress of Rail Baltica as a project motivated first by geopolitical concerns of the Baltic states. In Lithuania, its role in the Eastern neighborhood is also often framed as returning to its historical links with those former territories of Lithuanian Grand Duchy, going back to 13th century, 14th century, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The book of Norman Davis, Vanished Kingdoms, in one of the chapters talks about that. You can see the territory of more or less what used to be in the late Middle Ages Lithuanian Grand Duchy. So this role of Lithuania mediating between, for example, Ukraine and EU institutions or other EU member states, often together with Poland, let's say Lithuania's presidents often acted as mediators together with Polish presidents during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005, later during the Maidan events in 2014, also in Georgia during the so-called Rose Revolution. All this is often framed as acting as a mediator because, due to historical legacy, Lithuania is seen as a credible mediator in those Eastern Partnership countries, and also because it is a EU member state providing a good example of how to implement domestic reforms and at the same time to establish itself within the community of liberal democracies in Europe. And to conclude on the evolution of narratives, what has changed during those 15 years, it's this narrative of modernization. Baltic Tigers has been a phrase also used by some Western journalists and analysts, for example, The Economist, which referred to relatively fast convergence of Baltic states with the EU average. And Lithuania has been one of the fastest converging Central and Eastern European countries since it joined the European Union. But since rates of emigration started increasing, in particular after the crisis of 2008-2009, especially from Lithuania and Latvia, significant numbers of people started migrating to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and this was reflected in intense debates, public political debates, in particular during the election campaigns, about what is wrong with Lithuanian governance. It was not so much about the negative effects of EU membership, let's say free movement of people, but more about what has not been done in Lithuania, the unfinished homework, so to speak, in terms of reforming economic structure, reforming governance in Lithuania. And another issue which has been becoming important is the perspective of the decline of EU funding after the current financial perspective ends. So, since the half an hour is ending, I will also conclude very briefly with a few comments on the EU narrative in Lithuania and other Baltic states compared to other EU member states. I think one clear difference, which may be found in Poland to some extent, is the importance of security concerns in most things that are linked to being part of Europe, and more concretely to different European Union policies. For example, when Estonia was introducing euro, it joined the Eurozone a bit earlier than Lithuania in 2011. Its president at the time, President Ilves, was particularly emphasizing security motivation, so that Estonia would use the same currency as the rest of the Eurozone, because this will contribute to security of Estonia. And only after that he was talking about economic benefits of being part of the single currency area. As I said, energy policy, transport policy is also to a large extent securitized by Lithuanian elites. Modernization narrative has been weakened to some extent because of demographic trends. And differently to some other EU member states, although there is now this competing narrative of the EU having to become Europe of nations, alternative vision to the close integration and Lithuania being in the most integrated core, something that was articulated since mid-1990s by Lithuanian elites. But as the most recent results of elections into the European Parliament in Lithuania seem to suggest, this newly emerging narrative of Europe of nations has a rather limited public support, and it was mostly mainstream parties that have been supporters of Lithuania being in the most integrated core of EU member states that gained most votes in the elections to the European Parliament. And to end, what is characteristic of Brexit debate in Lithuania is that it shows the same elements, the same dimensions of narrative on Europe in Lithuania. Concerns with what happens with security, for example, presence of British troops in the Baltic states, Britain as a NATO member continuing to devote attention to this region. Also what happens to the rights of citizens in the UK, so this is linked to debates on migration, citizenship, EU funding, what happens to EU funds after the UK leaves, and also another interesting dimension, which I think led to a very strong support for the Irish position of having a backstop in the withdrawal agreement, is small states versus large states after the UK leaves the European Union. So, thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer your questions.